Hi, this is Jane Monheit, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Today, we continue our ongoing series, Children of Genius. We've got John Barnes, son of New York Modernist architect Edward Larrabee Barnes, and we'll chat with Ainsley Gores Gilligan, daughter of one of the Harvard Five, Connecticut architect Landis Gores. And now, your host, Mr. Modernism, George Smart, son of architect George Smart, Sr.
Hi, I'm George, and I'm the child of an architect.
Hi, George.
You know, there really should be a support group for children of architects. We've had enough of them on the show to start one. Eric and Susan Saarinen, children of Eero. Raymond and Dion Neutra, children of Richard. Grandchildren of Frank Lloyd Wright and Ray Eames. And children of Craig Ellwood, Bill Cody, Charlie Gwathmey, Charles Deaton, and many more. Their fathers, and an occasional mother, came up in their careers during the heyday of modernism, the period between 1945 and 1970, when architecture magazines, and there were so many more than today, were bursting at the seams with 350 or more pages every single month, mostly modernist houses and churches and schools and hospitals and incredible airports and museums. Today, you're lucky if a design magazine exceeds 120 pages. My architect dad, like thousands of architects in his generation, was in love with modernism and thought and dreamed and sketched building after building after building, inspired by Aalto and Gropius and Breuer and Mies and reading all those magazines in the 50s. But, like thousands of architects of his generation, he had the talent to do modernist buildings, but didn't have many clients in North Carolina who wanted modernism. Clients in your area with the vision and budget are the difference between being a Charlie Gwathmey in New York and being a George Smart in the backwaters of Raleigh, North Carolina. Like all his design pals, my dad would try to sneak modernism into his churches and schools. A clear-story window here, a slanted wall there, a useful skylight or atrium where no one would expect it. Here on the show, we talk about the famous architects, but the real heroes of modernism are the thousands of architects who maybe got to design 4 or 5 modernist houses in their entire careers. These are the houses in your town it's important to preserve, or at least document. Otherwise, all that legacy of those journeymen and journeywomen architects will simply be lost. This support group for children of architects sounds better the more I talk about it. We could use AA as a model. Although, unlike AA, we will definitely serve martinis at the meetings. Shaken, not stirred. Uber, would you be the sponsor, please? U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Edward Larrabee Barnes was a modernist architect who trained with Gropius and Breuer at Harvard before starting his own firm in New York City. Nearly 500 architects worked for Barnes over the firm's 45-year existence, creating a lineage matched by very few practices. Along with well-known projects such as the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts, the Dallas Museum of Art, and the IBM building on Madison Avenue, Barnes also designed dozens of wonderful modernist houses, which you can see at usmodernist.org/Barnes. Joining us today to talk about Edward Larrabee Barnes is his son, John Barnes, who's also an architect. Welcome to the show, John.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me.
Hey, John, before we get started about architecture, we found an interesting quote. "And silence, like a poultice, comes to heal the blows of sound." Who said that?
I think it was Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Exactly. It was the inscription, I think, on your high school annual.
Really?
Well, you've been doing some research.
How was it to grow up in a modernist house? Your dad designed the house you grew up in, right?
That's right. It was built, I think it was finished in about 1952. It was actually a wonderful house to grow up in. For a number of years, it was a simple box. It cost about, I think, $35,000 to build, which maybe at the time was a fair amount, but seems pretty affordable now. And it was what he called a platform house. And there are several houses that he did that were like that, and actually that's carried forward in some of his other projects. And what I loved about it most was there was just 64 feet of plate glass, floor to ceiling, and it was just a rectangle with a bedroom at one end, a living room in the other, in the middle, and a kitchen at the other end. And then the bedrooms were sort of arranged behind the kitchen and then behind the master bedroom. And so it was a 3-bedroom house, and it was very simple. And then as I grew up, then they added some more wings and created more privacy, but it was a completely open planned house.
It was also well published. It was in Architecture Record Houses of 57. It was featured again in Architecture Record. Pretty well known at the time.
Yes, and it also showed up in the Herald Tribune and in their newspaper magazine. It showed up several places.
Was this the breakthrough house for your dad in terms of getting well known with other clients, or was that another one?
Well, that would be hard to say. I mean, I think the Wiener House in Texas was published. I can't remember the name of the book, but it's on modernist architecture. And then also the Reed House in Purchase, New York, which was very Breuer-esque. But I would say this and the Osborne House were the ones that really kick-started his career in terms of houses. And then after that, he actually went down a different road, which was the house for the Strausses in Pound Ridge, New York, which I think was, if you remember, in the early to mid-50s, there was a show at the Museum of Modern Art called the Japanese House, and I think he was very influenced by that. I think at this period in his life, he was still kind of searching around, looking at different ways to approach architecture. And I call it finding his voice. I think he was still trying to find his voice. And the platform houses that he did were kind of prescient because it reoccurs later. But the Strauss house was very Japanese in certain ways, quite a large house. But the structure was all revealed, beautifully detailed. And then a couple of years later, he did a radio station. And I think there he was influenced by Kiesler. And that was a spiral form in the shape of a nautilus. And so that was quite unusual.
This was a radio station studio that he designed, a building?
A radio station.
Where?
Radio station he did in Mount Kisco, New York for WVIP.
Uh-huh. Like a nautilus?
Well, the core, the center of it was a circle where the studio was. Uh-huh. And then the offices were arrayed in a spiral around it. And as a spiral obviously wrapped, it got larger and larger, then to a large window, which would be kind of emblematic of the opening of a shell. So it was the idea of a shell. And actually, there's a picture of me in the window in the front holding a shell and the sound of the ocean, all of that. So
I get it. I've worked in radio for a long time.
It's kind of cool. I don't think it exists anymore.
Sounds much more interesting than any of the stations I ever worked in. They were all just boxes.
Now, I think the spiral form, as the station grew, became kind of tough to expand into.
Oh, yeah.
So, like other sea creatures, I think they had to just leave their shell behind.
Now, John, as you were growing up, really two questions. At what point did you realize that your dad was kind of a big deal in the world of architecture? And then secondly, what had you decide to go into architecture yourself?
Let me think about that. Well, he started to get awards in the late 50s, early 60s. I was born in 51. My mother was one of the curators of architecture at the Museum of Modern Art and had done the installation for the Alto show and then worked in defense housing. And then they moved to California, as you know, San Francisco during the war, and then down to Pasadena. And then back to New York. And then she was working at a museum, and then I was born after that. And she had worked for Lubetkin when she lived in London for about 8 years. And they were quite well connected in a kind of informal way to the architecture scene in New York. And so I was aware of, probably through the people that we interacted with and some of the artists and things, with the fact that they were part of a group that were well known. And then my father, as an individual, I would say, I didn't really realize that until the early 60s. I tried to avoid being an architect for a long time and graduated from college in 73, but then didn't graduate from architectural school until 83.
What did you think you were going to be prior to that?
Well, as a child, I wanted to be a farmer, and then I wanted to be a teacher. And then I worked for a number of years on a boat in the summers, helping children learn how to sail and do nautical things. And then I got into land conservation, and I worked at the Trust for Public Land for several years, and I still am involved with some of those efforts. But then a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, said, well, would you mind designing us a house? I mean, I had done some contracting too. I had done some building. And so I designed a house in Woodside, California, found that enjoyable, and decided to go back to school. And that was sort of what drew me into it.
Was your dad happy about that?
I think he was quite happy about that, yeah.
Yeah.
And then I went to work in the office. After I graduated, I got a traveling fellowship and traveled around Europe, and then came back and worked in his office for several years.
Your dad realized, like most architects, that houses are a money loser, but he didn't give them up. In fact, he kept doing occasional houses all the way into the 80s. What kept him coming back to them?
I think it's a personal thing, and I think he really enjoyed the intimacy. When you do a house, it's unlike anything else because you get to know your client really well, and you get to know everything about them. When they wake up, when they go to bed, what they do during the day, their routines, how they like to hang their clothes, all of those things on a granular level are things that I think he enjoyed. And he was able to, not always, obviously, but with certain clients, really do things that he would not have been able to do on a larger scale. And I think some of his most successful buildings are the smaller scale buildings, like Haystack or the Heckscher House or the Osborne House. I think those work very well the way they work in the site. And he was very interested in siting and topography and how a house sat on a site, but also as a place to live. And the Coles House was another one, the Strauss House. I mean, I've been there. I've spent time with those families as a child, and they really worked remarkably well for each family, and each one is completely different than the other.
And you've been invited back to do renovations on a lot of your father's houses, I believe, including the house you grew up in, right?
Well, I worked on that. Yeah, he and I worked on a wing on that. Yeah.
Okay.
To say that I built the renovation, and I had some input on the design, but I wouldn't say I had a lot of input. There was a large triangular window that I detailed, and how to detail. There's a flush skylight that I worked on, and some other things, and the copper roof. You know, there's some things that I worked on, but the basic form was his.
One of my favorite projects of your dad's, just to see visually, I've not been there, are the El Monte apartments in San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Yes.
These are really gorgeous, and they're a predecessor to a similar-looking building, also famous, the Watergate in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
Large, curved buildings. I understand they're still there and still very highly prized.
Yes, I've had architect friends who've been to Puerto Rico and have gone to see them, and they seem to be in pretty good shape. The high-rise and the low-rise buildings really hold up pretty well.
Like other architects of his generation, your dad taught. He taught at UVA and Pratt and Harvard, and of course mentored people over the years.
And he was also quite active at Yale. A number of his early employees, I think he used his teaching as a way to also find people to hire.
What did he try to impart to his students, do you think? What were the messages he was trying to get across?
I've been on crits with him, and he respects people trying to find their way. I think one of the things you see when you look at a student with an idea, and then the question is the idea relevant to this particular project? But then more importantly, particularly in school, how did you execute the idea? And I think that's what he was most interested in, was trying to get at the nugget of the idea. And then how did a student approach that and help them find different ways or other ways to clarify? He was very interested in clarity, and he used the word lucidity a lot. And the other phrase I remember hearing was effort versus effect. You don't want to do any excess effort that doesn't really enhance the effect you're trying to achieve. He also quoted Breuer a few times. Breuer would say, why not to do it? And so there was this kind of dialectic between a kind of a refining of the idea, but then also breaking out of that to say, well, why not to do this? And so that I think he, in his own work and then also with students, was always trying to work between those two paradigms. I think it allowed his work to be less dogmatic and more contextual than a lot of his peers.
Now, your mom, Mary, you mentioned earlier, she was an accomplished architect. And did she work with Alvar Aalto?
She was working at the Museum of Modern Art and did the installation, designed the installation for the first Aalto show at the museum, I guess in the late 30s. I'm going to say 38-ish, after she'd come back from London.
So she would have worked with Philip Johnson at that time?
Yes.
That must have been pretty exciting for her, for your family.
I mean, I obviously wasn't around at the time, but yes, that was a very heady time. My parents weren't married until 44, and they met, I think, in 42. She had been married previously in London to an English attorney and divorced, and then she lived in London for about 8 years and then came to New York. She was quite a remarkable woman in her own right.
And when your dad died almost 20 years ago now, the obituary in the New York Times quoted him as saying that most architectural ideas can be expressed on the back of an envelope. I was wondering if that was actually a true quote.
Yes.
Do you agree?
I do agree. I think that if you can distill down your idea, for instance, he did that was never built. He worked on a Native American museum in Santa Fe, and it was very simple. It was just a square with a circle inside. And I don't in any way want to oversimplify these two cultures or anything, but it was the circle represented the Hopi culture, which was more stationary, and then around the outside, the Navajo culture, which was more nomadic, was constrained at certain points, and then at the corners expanded. And so in the way the museum actually, the circulation worked and the way just the basic form, the idea was to reflect these two cultures. And it was as simple as a circle inside of a square. And the Walker Art Center is another one, very simple idea in section and in plan. It varies, obviously. And sometimes those ideas can be too boiled down, and then they don't work as well. And that's where you have to break out of that as well. But he was always sketching at a small scale, on little scraps of paper and things.
I remember that about my dad, too. When he passed away, I would find these pads of paper from supply companies like brick and asbestos and stone and wood, and he would scribble little things on the pads they would give away at conferences.
Right, exactly.
Your dad was best known, I think, publicly for a lot of his museums and museum work. Have you gotten to visit those as an adult?
I've seen some. I've not seen all by any means. I've been to the Walker. I love that building. I never have gotten to Dallas. I'd like to see Dallas, and it's about to have an addition. What else have I seen? I've worked on a couple of museums when I was in the office. I know I've seen some others. I just can't remember where they are.
John, thanks so much for spending time with us and sharing your memories of your dad. If you'd like to see more of Edward Larrabee Barnes' residential work, you can look it all up at usmodernist.org/Barnes. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
That was our conversation with John Barnes, son of Edward Larrabee Barnes.
Ainsley Gores Gilligan is an editor based near Portland, Maine, but she grew up in the epicenter of New England modernism, New Canaan, Connecticut. She's the daughter of architect Landis Gores, who won an AIA gold medal right out of graduate school in 1942. Then he went on to work with Philip Johnson on the very famous Glass House before starting his own firm in 1951. Despite contracting polio in the 1950s, he became a legendary member of the Harvard Five, which is not a doo-wop group. It is the name that was given to 5 important architects associated with Harvard's architecture program. So welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, Ainslie.
Well, thank you very much.
Ainslie, how was it to grow up in your parents' house built in 1948? When did you realize there was something special about the house that was not like a lot of other houses in town?
What I remember is about 6th grade, being introduced to the New Canaan Country School, where I was now going to go to school, and meeting some people and going to their houses. For some reason, it really struck me then, I think, because my mentor there, the girl that mentored me, had a brand new house. That was a very fancy house, but it was a very fancy, brand new colonial house. And I was very aware that, the houses of most people around me were nothing like my house. And it never bothered me. I liked it. I liked it that my house was different. And I even had a friend whose father was a modern architect too, but his house didn't feel like my house. So I had this feeling that my father's house was special, not only because it was modern, but because it was incredibly solid and graceful and airy, that not all modern houses were.
I know in some communities in the 50s and 60s, the modernist architects would hang out together and do things as families. Was that the case in New Canaan? Did the modern architects hang out with each other? Were they friends?
Well, I think they were good friends, and I heard that mostly from my mother, that they kibitzed together, they had lunch together. My father writes in his memoir about how closely several of the offices were downtown. When he left Philip Johnson's office in 1951, he moved in with Joe Johansson, and that Elliot Noyes was down the street. And they could just go to the diner and talk. And they had a lot of sort of informal get-togethers, I believe, and I remember a big cocktail party when I was little and all the architects talking. But my dad got sick when I was 7. He got polio, and so he was pretty much removed from that scene after that, physically.
At what point did you realize that your dad was an architect and that was really something special, as opposed to, just something your dad did?
I think it was around that same time. I think you go through a lot of changes around 6th grade, 5th grade. That's when you start really looking at the world around and making your own observations, I think. I mean, it's most pronounced in adolescence, but it starts a little earlier, or at least it did for me and my friends. And yeah, I did realize it was something different, and I did realize it was creative. But the predominant ethos in New Canaan and Connecticut was so clearly hearkening back to the colonial days and New England colonial architecture, and just the standard way of life. No, I didn't know very many people who had any kids except the one I mentioned, who had a sense of what modern architecture even was. So it wasn't something you talked about with anybody, but I think it came in around then very strongly for me.
Since you grew up in New Canaan, I was wondering about the town's reaction to modernism, because when I look back at the magazine articles and the letters to the editor, the town was not very warm to modernism at all, was it?
No, it wasn't. And the glass house became a phenomenon, and there were all these tie-ups on Ponus Ridge, and the police were bothered by having to take care of traffic jams. And one solution was to make the Modern House Day. I don't know, I think that started in 49. Let's get all these people to come out to New Canaan for this strange new pursuit. Let's get them all out at the same time, but it didn't work. And there was enough publicity and notoriety so that ordinary residents just thought it was more than they wanted to do with.
There was great opposition at times to other houses being built around town as well. I've seen letters to the editor which almost wax poetic in terms of how disruptive they thought modernism was to their little town.
And that I wouldn't know anything about, really, except that there were all these letters in the Advertiser. You know that stuff, right?
Right.
That Bill Earls talks about in his book.
Yes.
But I was just a child pretty much when that stuff was going on, or younger than sixth grade. I just wasn't really aware of those things.
Now, the Gores house, the original one, I believe, is protected by a preservation easement, right?
Yes, that's the one I grew up in.
So
it's on the National Register, and its easements are held by the National Trust.
So how did you decide to secure that easement? Because that's something a lot of modernist homeowners don't know about.
It was my mother. My mother brought it up back. My father died in 91, and around 2000, she was getting a lot of questions from people about his work, and she was trying to see what his legacy was. And she got the idea of putting easements on it, but then she backed out. But she enlisted me to help her at that time around 2000, and I had contacted the National Trust, and so we had a backstory with them. We had spoken with them about the possibility of easements, and they had shown interest at the time, so that when, maybe 2016 or so, that we went back to them and said, now we're ready, now we want to protect the house, they were willing to work with us, even though they didn't do much of that anymore. The interior easements. I mean, exterior easements they do. But that they would do an interior easement, they really did it because we had a history of communication, and they had committed to it back when they still did interior easements.
I'd never heard of an interior easement before.
Yeah, it's just an extension of the easement agreement to include more detail.
Like not to take down walls?
No, it's not.
No?
No, the exterior is the facade. The interior is changing the walls inside, the doors. What you perceive from inside the houses is what the interior easement covers. In this case, it covers the living room and the foyer, because those are the two most unique rooms in the house. So that means that nobody can do anything to change those features. They can't change the materials or the way things are put together. They have to keep it exactly as it has been. And seeing as the house has been in the family all these years, it's a very rare thing for that to happen, but it's true. Nothing's been changed anyway, so they have the original, and then they just have to keep it in those two rooms. And everything they do in those two rooms, they have to tell the National Trust.
Is that hard to enforce?
Not really,
No.
But it's one of the reasons they don't do interiors anymore is that it does make it rather difficult to make normal changes you might expect within houses. And so most of the easements now are exterior. But like this, there are exceptions. Ainslie, this was the original house that your parents built, and they built another one around 1979 called the House for All Seasons. What happened to that house?
Yes, around 1977. Well, I'm very interested because when I read your online description about it, you say that the reason it was torn down was because of deterioration and mold, or that was part of it. I don't know what the other part was, probably market forces, because that was very much part of it. So I never heard about the mold. I never even heard, so to speak, about the deterioration, although I heard that the people who owned it did not take good care of it. I didn't hear that it was in what sounds like disrepair, according to your entry.
And it got torn down.
Oh, yeah, what I heard was that it was a really nice site, and the McMansions had come in. They were big. It was a really big time for giant houses. And even though it was a giant house itself, it was a very unusual one, and everybody in the culture at large wanted a Center Hall colonial. So some developer bought it and tore down my dad's house and put that house up.
Now, one of your dad's most famous buildings, the Gores Pavilion, is open to the public. What will people find when they go there?
Well, you would have to ask Nancy Geary what's happening exactly with that. But as I understand it, there's a permanent exhibit in one wing and a revolving exhibit in another wing, these little wings to the pavilion, and that people can visit by appointment.
Okay.
It's not open all the time.
The pavilion was a house originally?
Well, you could call it a house. It was a pool house.
A pool
It
house.
was built for Jane Watson Irwin and her husband because they needed a little summer pool house to entertain at, so they wouldn't have to bring everybody up to the big house, which at that point was a drafty, dated old mansion that they didn't use all the time. So they sometimes used the pool house to entertain, and they knew my dad well. John Irwin and my dad used to go to New York on the train together, and they asked him to do it. It wasn't a summer house. It was a four-season house, a little pool house.
So is the mansion gone or still there?
Well, it's kind of interesting that the mansion was demolished. A new mansion was built, and that mansion, last I saw, was not being used. It had been used for some town offices for quite a while, but at least in the last 5 years, it's been empty, and so it has that sort of abandoned look to it now. Mm-hmm.
During World War II, our research team found out that your dad was in intelligence?
Well, he didn't start out that way.
How did he start out?
But, let's see, I wrote this for the website. Maybe I can read it to you. After graduation, Gores reported for active duty with the 1st Cavalry Division, but he soon applied as an officer, quote, versed in enemy language, because he was German, quote, to the Army's new military intelligence training center, hoping to draw on his ancestral German. Accepted into the program at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, he was tested only in French, then trained as a French liaison officer. But he managed, meantime, with the help of 2 staff sergeants and an obscure German handbook, to learn German military organization, equipment, and tactics. Shipped off to London in 1943, upon arrival, he was informed that his designated posting behind enemy lines in France had been canceled due to massive reorganization of the invasion buildup. Days later, a friend from Camp Ritchie got him an interview with his chief officer in charge, as it turned out, of a small group of Americans aiding the top-secret British effort to decode intercepts from the German high command.
That must have been the Enigma project.
Gores spent 18 months interpreting Nazi troop movements for Ultra. It was called Ultra, and then Enigma was the machine.
Right,
Okay.
right. That was the German machine, and then MK Ultra was trying to crack it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then there was the Polish machine that started it all. But anyway, my dad was awarded the Legion of Merit and the Order of the British Empire for doing that. There were 12 Americans, and he ended up one of them just because he'd memorized the German handbook, and they needed him.
and apparently he had some fluency in German to begin with, right?
His father was German. His mother was German, I guess. I mean, her family had been in Tokyo as missionaries, but they were German too, so he came from a totally German background.
Wow.
Of all the projects your father did, Ainslie, what are some of your favorites?
That's a good question. I always liked the Close House.
Where's that?
It's somewhere near Litchfield, Connecticut. I'm not sure. There's a couple of different New
Preston, Connecticut.
New Preston, okay. Yeah, it sort of depends on how you slice it. But it isn't there anymore. It's been destroyed. Joan Rivers bought it.
Really?
And she didn't like it, so she tore it down. I guess she bought it for the site. Mm-hmm.
Well, what do you know?
That was one of my favorites, and Robert DeMora did a couple of really nice photos of that.
We have a few photos of that on the website, but we didn't know whatever happened to it. Thanks for filling in that mystery.
Joan Rivers tore it down.
Yeah.
Wow.
Can we
She
talk?
said it was one of she thought it was one of the ugliest things she'd ever seen. And what she put up was, of course, just exactly what you'd expect.
Yeah.
Of a Center Hall Colonial with green shutters and white clapboard. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. What year was this approximately?
I don't remember. In the 80s, I think, but I could be wrong.
All right. Well, we'll look all that up and get that updated on the site. Ainslie, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to us all the way from Maine.
And thank you. It was fun to talk to you.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 20,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.2 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl with Kelly Policelli on guest research. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another Children of Genius edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.
Children of Genius.